Sorry, would you please respect the Speaker, and thank you. No talking in the galleries, please. Thank you. Leave the chamber if you're leaving. Thank you.
Karen Corley, that's part of the problem we have. The government of today does not respect the opposition. Minister, this budget is all about using borrowed money to buy votes. The headline element of your budget today is your income tax proposals. That's the headline measure, Minister, your income tax proposals. And having decided to go down the road of income tax, I honestly believe you have made a mess of it. And let me give you a number of examples, Minister. We've heard all the rhetoric that this would be the budget to reduce the burden on low and middle income families. An individual working full-time, earning €32,000 a year, is going to benefit from your income tax package by €174 a year. €174 a year, Minister. The same individual, Minister, will of course now be facing water charges of €200, €300, €400. Who knows? That individual is certainly worse off as a result of this budget.
Sorry, Deputy. Listen, I asked for silence when the Minister was making his contribution. I now ask for silence from the opposition deputies, please. We do live in a democracy, in case you've forgotten about it. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
You see, we have to listen to you. You see, Karen Corley, this is part of the problem we have, because this government is completely intolerant of any criticism, of any debate about its measures. It believes it is invincible. Well, I can tell you this much, you're not invincible. I am standing here on this side of the House with a mandate to represent people and to question your budget. And I will do so based on facts and based on fairness. So please show a little bit of respect, not to me, but to the people I represent, and listen to what I have to say. The headline package in your income tax proposal, Minister, in your budget, is your income tax proposal. I gave the first example. An individual earning €32,000 a year is better off to the tune of €174 per annum, before we even talk about water charges. In contrast, an individual earning €70,000 a year will benefit to the tune of €746 a year, 4 times greater. Take the example of a couple on one income, Minister, an income of less than €41,800 a year. They too will benefit by €174. That's an average couple, Minister. One of them working, the other one staying at home to mind the kids. The tax benefit that you're giving to them is €174 a year, more than wiped out by the water charges that you're introducing. So let's be honest about what this budget is really about. In contrast, if you have a two-income couple, both earning €70,000 a year, because the universal social charge is calculated on an individual basis, as you know. Combining the gain on USC, the expansion of the low rate band and the cut to the marginal rate of tax, they will be up by about €1,500 a year. Now, I have to say, Minister, that your tax proposals are very unfair, not just on low-income families, but especially on families where one parent decides to stay at home. You're not extending the low rate band by €2,000, you're extending it by just €1,000 for a couple, the same as you are for an individual. That is fundamentally unfair. When I heard last night about an email that the Taoiseach sent to her Labour Party colleagues, it said something like, the budget would mainly benefit low and middle income earners, working families and vulnerable groups. You wouldn't get that propaganda in North Korea, Taoiseach. I honestly thought that Kim Jong-un had come out of exile to write an email to the Labour Party. That is how misleading it actually was. This Fine Gael Labour government in Ceann Comhairle has decided to fire the first shot today in their general election campaign, and in doing so have proved that they have learned nothing from the crisis that we have just come through. This is a budget straight from the book of old school politics, a budget that is more about short-term political gain than what is right for the economy and our people. But it is also a budget that exposes very clearly this government's flawed priorities. At the first opportunity and the first sign of a recovery, the government's priority is not to undo some of the social harm caused by 6 tough years of austerity, but instead to design tax cuts that disproportionately put far more money in the pockets of higher income earners. That, for me, speaks volumes about where this government's priorities lie. We all know this government's first three budgets were deeply regressive, hitting low and middle income families the hardest and leaving the highest income earners in the country off virtually scot-free. When this government cut the respite care grant, cut supports for special needs children and abolished the telephone allowance, no corresponding sacrifice was required by those who had the most. The government is now borrowing money to give a tax cut which will give by far and away the greatest benefit to the better off, and which everyone else will have to repay with interest. That is what is happening. This is the government's first budget since the end of the EU-IMF agreement. This budget gives us a clear sense of this government's lack of priorities. There is no vision for what a post-austerity Ireland will look like, no statement of our values as a people, no talk of fairness or social solidarity, and most depressingly of all, no indication that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated. The government's promise of an end to boom and bust policies rings as hollow as the promise to abolish the prescription charge, the promise to give free GP care to all, and the promise not to increase student fees. People have sacrificed too much for the recovery to be put in jeopardy. Ceann Comhairle, this is a government that took medical cards off the sick, the dying and the disabled until they were shamed into giving them back. This is a government that broke promise after promise after promise in the hope that people would just stop noticing. This is a government that promised an end to cronyism, but instead brought it to a new level. This is a government that delivers income tax cuts for the better off, but abandons the homeless and those crying out for mental health supports. This is a government that deliberately targeted single parents, women, vulnerable elderly people and young people out of work. This is a government that promised us new politics. Well, I think we all know what happened to that. Prior to coming to office, Fine Gael and Labour opposed every measure designed to close the budget deficit, but they now claim 100% of the credit for the job that was two-thirds done for them. The simple fact is this government is now aiming for a deficit that is higher than what it would be if you did nothing today. The opening position for next year is forecasting a deficit of 2.4%, but you're planning to bring that up to 2.7%. Staying the course has been roundly defeated by political expediency and the imperative of the next election. Ceann Comhairle, there is something very disturbing about the way the Independent Irish Fiscal Advisory Council has been treated by this government. And anyone listening to John McHale, the chairman today on Morning Ireland, would really have sat up and taken notice. It's not that I agree with everything that they have said, but I have taken what they have said into account in a genuine way. This government has ignored time and again the independent advice of that council without giving an adequate explanation for doing so. The council advising €2 billion of an adjustment, the government is going in the other direction to the tune of about €1 billion. That is the reality, Minister, and you can shake your head. Instead, Ministers Noonan and Howlin have launched the lifeboat to try to save as many backbench Labour and Fine Gael seats as possible in the next 18 months. Ceann Comhairle and Fianna Fáil welcome the recent improvement in the economy. There is a recovery taking place. The positive economic data has given people hope that the pain they endured continues to be worthwhile. I know you don't like what I'm saying, and that's why you're heckling. You're trying to drown out what I'm saying. Both ministers were afforded a lot of respect by the opposition, and you're not affording the same respect to us. So, Ceann Comhairle, the economic upturn has happened very quickly. Last year we had hardly any economic growth at all, and the same the previous year. So we make no apologies for urging a degree of caution. In our view, it is time to take a deep breath, to secure the recovery, to assess the real risks, especially external risks, that this country is still facing, and address gaps in vital public services which have opened up in recent years. Any spare resources need to be targeted at those who really need it, and those who have borne the brunt of budget cutbacks in recent times. Up to a few weeks ago, the government was predicting modest growth of 2% this year. Now, a raft of positive economic data emerged in very quick succession. not foreseen by this government either, by the way, and it has resulted in the prediction now that the economy will grow by about 5%. In our view, we would be in a much better position and have a much clearer set of data in about 12 months' time as to the real state of the Irish economy, the public finances and indeed the international outlook. And I think you actually know that, Minister Noonan, yourself. But of course the imperative of electoral politics has kicked in. Or as one minister put it in his weekend newspaper, we may not get another budget, he or she anonymously said. In other words, this is the election to spend the money and try to save as many seats as we can. Well, Minister, we in Fianna Fáil are taking a different approach, and for the first time in decades, because you didn't do it in opposition, there is an opposition party prepared to stand back and show the courage to advocate responsible politics rather than popular politics, which you are promoting. In opposition, Fine Gael and Labour were cheerleaders for cutting taxes and raising spending. In fact, you were insatiable with your demands during the Celtic Tiger years. Fianna Fáil has learned from the mistakes of the past. This government is about to repeat them. Let me say this, Minister, auction politics was wrong in the past and it is wrong now. We need to accept that this country still faces key risks, many of them external, as I have said. The Eurozone economy is flagging. As you well know, economic indicators in Germany are deteriorating rapidly. France is seeking 2 further years to bring its deficit into line, and the serious problems in Greece are resurfacing again. The historic low interest rates enjoyed by this state for borrowing will not last indefinitely. The forecast for world growth has been downgraded, and regional conflicts always have the capacity to cause economic instability. Ireland is indeed a small, open economy which relies heavily on external trade. We are, more than most, at the mercy of external factors, but that doesn't seem to have figured too much in your consideration. That is why the recovery should have been allowed to take its first breath before we start giving away the money which you are borrowing to do. We do know some things about the recovery, though, Minister. The recovery has not spread right around the country. And for many people, indeed, the word recovery is absolutely meaningless. If you have a child with special needs awaiting an assessment of need, or seeking access to speech and language therapy or occupational therapy, there is no recovery for you. If you are an elderly person who cannot afford to pay private health insurance and you're waiting for a knee operation, there is absolutely no recovery for you. If you have a loved one waiting to gain access to a nursing home, waiting 4 months now for funding under the Fair Deal scheme, hanging on by their fingertips at home with threadbare support from the state, there is no recovery for you. And if you are a homeless person sleeping not 200 yards from the gate of this stall, there is absolutely no recovery for you. Taoiseach, there are bigger questions to answer. What are we about as a people? What do we really stand for? What are our priorities? And people look to you, Taoiseach, for vision. Anyone listening to you over the last number of months would say that your vision is to cut the marginal rate of tax, which will benefit 1 in 6 income earners. A consultant orthopaedic surgeon went on Liveline last week and said that in the National Orthopaedic Hospital, all 7 operating theatres are closed because the HSE cannot afford to buy the hip replacements. Is that the country that we're living in today? All the while, waiting list spiral, and this government's top priority is to cut the marginal rate of tax. Well, I think it says a lot about the choices which you have made, and people will in time see through those choices, because there is an innate decency in the Irish people. We saw it with the medical cards fiasco over the last couple of years. Even people who weren't affected by what your government did, the unintended consequence of putting €113 million into your budget to save from medical cards, which resulted in people losing medical cards, which you say was never meant to happen. There was a decency in people. Even though they weren't affected, it hit them hard. And that's what people will see in the choices that you have made. That is why we, as a party, have said that extra resources should be made available to areas where a real difference can be made at this time. Improving access to childcare, especially for people looking to access work. Building on the free preschool year introduced by Fianna Fáil, reducing class sizes for our children, which we know gives better educational outcomes and which is the best long-term investment that we can make in this country and indeed our economy. Prioritising mental health and suicide awareness. Looking after vulnerable people who are older and who need supports at this time. to name but a few priorities. Increasing mortgage interest relief for those who are drowning under the burden of high mortgages, especially those on variable interest rates. Deputy Fleming will speak about a number of those areas in more detail in a moment. Minister, a few weeks ago you gave all the credit to the government for the recovery. The truth is, Minister, that apportioning credit for a recovery that most people do not see is really of little consequence. And it says more about the insecurity of this government than anything else. In my view, the economic progress which has been made can be attributed to a number of factors, not least the reduction in the budget deficit, a process which, as you well know, started back in 2008. And it is a fact you may not welcome, but a fact nonetheless, that Fianna Fáil in government, your predecessor in your office, the late Brian Lenihan, introduced 2/3 of the budget adjustment which has been central to our recovery. But above all else, and Minister Howland alluded to this, the sacrifices of the Irish people have brought us to the point where there is now clear light at the end of the tunnel. As we know on income tax, the government in recent times tried to dampen down the very expectations that it had built up itself. And if you look through the budget booklet, and it gives examples of all Joe and Mary and Michael and Teresa and how they're affected by the budget, well, there's one very obvious thing omitted, Minister, and that is the fact that when the Christmas tree is still standing in the corner of the sitting room, the first bill for water charges will arrive in the door. Now, you will say it's not an issue for the budget. It's not a budgetary matter. But, Minister, the reality for people watching at home is that it is a budgetary issue for them. When they're trying to balance the books in terms of their household budget, it is an issue that they have to take account of. Because, Minister, it was you who set up Irish Water. It was you who gave the approval to spend €180 million in setting up the organisation, and another €500 million on installing meters before a pipe is even fixed around the country. You gave the CER the instructions in relation to water charges, and the tables that you have published in the back of the budget book are absolutely meaningless. Meaningless. They might be meaningful to you and the officials who drew them up, but, Minister, these bills will be arriving in the door in January, and as I have outlined, for many people, especially individuals on low income, who will benefit to the tune of €174, and even net of the tax relief that you're proposing to give them on the water charges, they'll be paying probably €200 to €300 at least. So they'll be out of pocket. They're worse off as a result of the budget, which we were told was designed to help them. How did you manage to achieve that? Spending €1 billion that you didn't have, which you borrowed, and the very people that you're trying to help are worse off. A couple with one spouse working, earning €40,000, is worse off as a result of your budget. I mean, that is an extraordinary achievement, Minister. Yeah, others are better off, and the analysis will come out in the fullness of time. But for a government who stated its objective was to lift the burden on people who were feeling it the most, then you have singularly failed, and once again you have failed the test of fairness. And doesn't it say something about a government that when you're taking money off people, you have no accountability to pay then? When you're taking money out of people's pay packet, as you did when you abolished the PRSI exemption, you took €264 off everyone, whether they were earning $20,000 a year or $200,000 a year. But oh no, when it's time to give something back, you don't do it that way. You don't give everyone the same. You don't look after the person working on the minimum wage or the family struggling on €35,000 or €40,000 a year, who are above all of the social welfare eligibility thresholds. Supplementary welfare, family income supplement, rent supplement, medical card, they get none of that. And they're worse off as a result of this budget, Minister. There is no doubt, Minister, and we all accept, that the marginal rate of tax in this country is high. And you would have been much better off in this budget, increasing tax credits, for example, which would have benefited everybody equally. Instead, you've gone with a mishmash approach. You say you're reducing the marginal rate of tax, and you are up to the level of €70,000. We're told that it was a big issue for inward investment, that when Minister Bruton is going abroad to New York trying to attract in the big executives, that they're very worried about the marginal rate of tax. Well, I don't think they're earning less than €70,000, Minister. It was all about getting the headline. It was all about fulfilling the commitment to reduce the marginal rate of tax, rather than using the tax system to really redistribute resources and introduce equity to the system. Which brings me, Count Corlett, to the issue of budgetary reform. Because when Fine Gael and Labour were in opposition, they were going to do the divil and all in terms of budgetary reform. We were going to have open debates in this House and that committee about what the real options were. We were going to have a much more mature way about deciding on the budget of the country. The days of the big bang announcements on budget day were to be gone. Well, the truth is also different. The process of introducing the budget is more secretive now than at any time in the history of the state, with fewer people involved in actually making decisions than ever happened. We're told, Minister Noonan, that you brought the tax package to the Cabinet this morning on the day of the budget. A fundamental pillar of the budget was rubber stamped with no scope for changes by your Cabinet on the very day of the budget. Well, I can tell you, if I were your Cabinet colleague, I wouldn't be putting up with that, Minister. I certainly wouldn't put up with that. Never has so much power been concentrated in the hands of so few. It makes a mockery of the constitutional principle of collective Cabinet responsibility. This is not a mature way of framing the budget, where even those who are meant to be making the decision are kept in the dark right up until the last minute. Now, Minister, I've already said that the recovery is real, and we warmly welcome it, but you have had a little bit of luck along the way, which you failed to mention in your speech, and that is, of course, the European statistical standards, which I think it's worth explaining to people the difference that it has made. It has increased the level of Irish GDP by over €10 billion. Overnight, in July, the announcement came, the economy had grown by 6.5% overnight, not over a year, overnight, with the inclusion of illicit activities and a number of other issues. Now, that didn't affect growth rates because the previous year's GDP was changed as well, and I acknowledge that. But where it did matter, of course, was in respect of the percentage deficit, because while the cash deficit remained unchanged, it is now being expressed as a percentage of a much higher GDP figure. The result, of course, was that the deficit at the end of last year was recalculated down from 7.2% to 5.7%. bringing us an awful lot closer to the 3% limit than we would otherwise have been. Now, you got lucky on the technical reclassification, which could just as easily have gone the other way. But given that it did bounce in our favour on this occasion, it made a difference of €2.7 billion in respect of tax increases and spending cuts, which you did not have to bring in because of that. And that is very positive, but we got lucky on that one, Minister, even if you won't admit it. Minister, on the issue of corporation tax, I really hope, Minister, that the Irish football team in Gelsenkirchen tonight show a lot more resistance to German pressure than you did in relation to corporation tax. Because that's what has happened here, Minister. We all know you were under intense pressure from your colleagues in Germany, in the European Commission, the OECD, and I'm sure it was very uncomfortable going to ECOFIN and Eurogroup meetings over the last number of months. But you have decided to preempt the process here, Minister. You have made a number of positive changes in respect of intellectual property regime and others, which I welcome. But anything that introduces uncertainty in relation to Ireland's corporation tax regime is risky. And that's what you have done, Minister, because in relation to our, well, I know it's a touchy subject for you because I know you're very nervous about this announcement, but in respect of our offering for those who are looking to invest in Ireland, corporation tax is a vital tool. Now, you have stood over the 12.5% rate, and our party has long signed up to that, as you know, and we welcome it. But this is not some theoretical debate about tax planning or about the morality of multinational companies. It should come as no surprise to any of us. Multinational companies will employ the best tax practitioners in the world in an effort to minimise their global corporation tax liability. We all know that. You came into this House 2 years ago and you said that the double Irish had nothing to do with Irish law. Then it must be something to do with other jurisdictions and US law. I have to quote, Minister, and I won't waste my limited time in reading it out to you. You did. Now, you have made a change here which does affect the offering that Ireland is making in respect of corporation tax. And I worry about that, Minister, because it does introduce uncertainty. Because let there be no mistake about it, this is a debate about jobs and about investment. And other countries will not be satisfied with the change you've made. You've preempted the BEPS process, which has not been concluded. We've had an interim report, we've had no final report, we've had the Dutch, who are also under the spotlight from the EU, coming out saying they'll be making no changes until the process is complete. I am all for improving the global corporation tax regime, making it more transparent and reconstructing it in a way that multinational companies do pay more tax, but in a way where every country moves in tandem, step by step. That is not happening. You're talking about a new intellectual property regime, which will have to go to the European Commission. You sent a much more modest proposal to the European Commission 2 years ago on the Living Cities initiative, and you're still waiting for a decision from them in respect of that. So that really won't give any comfort to multinationals who are looking at investing in Ireland, because in my view, Minister, what you have done is a mistake, and that certainty which we have built around our corporation tax offering is beginning to crumble. And multinationals who are looking at where to invest, they look at the UK stepping up its game, introducing a patent box irrespective of what Europe says. They look at them bringing down their headline rate. They look at them streamlining the way that foreign profits are being taxed. And they look at Ireland shivering under pressure from Europe and others and making a change before there is any international consensus as to where this direction is going. And that, for me, is a mistake. We should do it in step with other countries, but you have chosen otherwise. Minister, the improvement in the employment situation is very welcome, and I agree with you that those who suffered the most, you've said this many times, in the economic collapse were those who lost their job, and we all want to see further jobs created in the economy. Progress has been made, but the real issue now in terms of jobs, Minister, is to tackle the stubbornly high number of people who are long-term unemployed. That is the real bottleneck in the jobs system as I can see it at this point in time. The 180,000 people who are on the live register for a year or more. And your government pays a lot of lip service to the issue of supporting SMEs and small business, but really you've done precious little to help them in practical terms. And if you travel outside Dublin, Minister, towns and villages are dying on their feet right around this country, and that's because small businesses can't survive. The SMEs that you say are the lifeblood of the Irish economy cannot survive. They are under immense pressure. Small businesses are closing. Young people are leaving rural areas and job opportunities are few and far between. We're developing a very lopsided country, with population and employment being pulled into the Dublin area with each passing day. Now, that's not good for people living in Dublin, Minister, because it creates pressures in relation to property prices, the cost of renting properties, and indeed other issues, and it is simply killing rural Ireland. The imbalance between the Greater Dublin area and the rest of the country needs to be talked about, and more importantly, it needs to be acted on. And Taoiseach, that is the kind of issue which I am highlighting in relation to vision that you should be articulating, but which we're not hearing anything about. Supporting small business has always been a core value of our party, and that's why we have proposed a number of innovative measures which would make a real difference, including a special 15% CGT rate for entrepreneurs, enhancing the employment and investment scheme to make it more attractive, allowing the new strategic banking corporation lend directly to SMEs, reforming the local authority rate system and linking it to the current performance of business, allowing the self-employed a voluntary opt-in scheme to give them greater PRSI benefits, tackling the excessive bureaucracy and red tape that businesses have to deal with, make the procurement system more user-friendly and accessible to SMEs, and reforming the tax system to make self-employment more attractive, especially for those at lower levels of income. And Minister, you seem to believe that the banking system in Ireland has been repaired. Well, I beg to differ, and I use a very simple measure. A young couple going into a bank today seeking to take out a mortgage for the first time to buy their very first home will invariably be paying 4.25% to 4.5% interest rate. A similar couple in the Eurozone will typically be paying about 2.5% for that mortgage. The same story applies to SMEs. They are paying way over the odds in respect of the cost of borrowing in this country than they are in other countries. The ECB has been reducing interest rates. The Irish economy has not benefited to the extent that it should from those rate cuts, Minister, because the banks have not been passing them on to people who are on variable products, whether it be SMEs or personal borrowers or mortgage holders. That is an issue that needs to be dealt with. Similarly, Minister, the issue of mortgages, which I'd love to go into and I haven't time to go into because I lost time having been heckled last Ceann Comhairle, but I won't eat into my colleague's time, Deputy Sean Fleming. I welcome, Minister, that you are finally abolishing the pension levy at the end of next year, having already broken your promise. It was to be gone at the end of this year. I said back in 2011, when you introduced it, I didn't think it would end in 2014. Instead of ending it, you increased it to 0.75%, and now you're retaining it next year at 0.15%. And when all of the deferred members of the Irish Aviation Superannuation Pension Scheme are contacting the members of the House, people who are facing a 60% cut in their benefits, and when they asked what this government's policy response was, this government's policy response was to put its hand into that pension fund and take more money out of it. You've taken €2.2 billion out of the private pension savings of our citizens. That was a scandal, Minister. It was legal theft. It should never have happened, and I'm glad you're finally coming to your senses and you're going to end it. This is a budget motivated by electoral strategy. It is a budget introduced by a government hoping that people will forget the way it targeted low and middle income families and how the most vulnerable bore the brunt of the budget adjustment in recent years. It is a budget from a government that spoke of a democratic revolution and promised ambitious political reform, but which has instead been the least accountable government in the history of the state. It comes from a government that is clearly motivated by the short term, even if it risks the sustainable recovery of our economy. The words of Talleyrand, speaking about the restored Bourbon dynasty after the abdication of Napoleon, spring to mind. They had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. Now we hand it over to the people to pass their judgment.